Hey, good afternoon. This is Jay Frost speaking, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this latest in the Flash Class series from Donor Search, of course. As you can see from the fancy new logo that Donor Search has just recently adopted right there in the corner of your screen. Once again, this is Jay Frost, and in the background, silently making sure that we don't veer off course, is Hannah Krobach. And we are here to bring you another in this series of classes that try to bring you the top voices in philanthropy and fundraising, not just domestically in the United States, from which we are broadcasting, if you wish to call it that, but also around the world. We are dedicated to bringing you some of those folks when they have time to share with you, and we are definitely doing that today with Ben Morton, Wright, who I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing in just a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to welcome you here, encourage you to grab your colleagues and friends, gather around your favorite electronic screen, get something nice to drink, and make yourselves comfortable for a great session. I'll also take just a couple of minutes to reintroduce, once again, this platform, because inevitably some of you may be new to it, others may not remember, and still others just need just a second to gather your forces. So we'll start with how you can get the slides and the recording. In the case of the slides today, what we're going to encourage you to do is let our presenter know that you'd like a copy with your email address, and he will be happy to send them to you. So you can do that by using the questions tab, as I'll explain in a moment. He'll also prompt you to do that again later. So again, to get the slides, you'll contact the presenter and he'll be happy to share with you. The recording, however, as with all of our sessions, will be posted right to the Flash Class library. So if you went to the donorsearch.net site, went to the Resources tab, just like you see on your screen, the third item down is the Flash Class library. And that is where you'd see a screen just like this one. And that includes all the sessions that have been recorded going back to mid-2016. We have no idea how many there are now. I know it's north of 160 and growing. Only 2 have not been recorded, so there's lots of content here to choose from. And this session, one of few we've had on international fundraising, will be there in just a couple of days. So do be on the lookout for it, and please do share it with colleagues. As we've often said in this series, and we've said offline and other places, the majority of the wealth of the world is outside the borders of the United States. And we have one of the top experts to address a big part of where philanthropy is really booming in Asia today. So that the recording, once again, right there under the Resources tab in just a couple of days, be on the lookout. Now, we do want to encourage you to interact, just as I said, starting with requesting a copy of the slides if you'd like them, but also to ask any question or make any comment you want at any time. I'll be providing those to our presenter at the conclusion today. So do take a look right where the bouncing arrow just landed in the Questions tab. Go ahead and enter any question, any comment, and that request for the slide deck, and I'll make sure to share those with our presenter when he finishes up so he can answer those questions in turn. If we don't get to everything rather, today, then we'll make sure to forward your questions on so he can answer them directly with you. Today's session, of course, is Principles of Fundraising Asia, and we have the right person to talk about this with you, and that is Ben Morton Wright. You're here, so you may already know who Ben is, but it's possible that you don't. And when people have asked in the past me about who to turn to in the world on these issues, Ben is a go-to person, but so is his firm, Global Philanthropic. He founded Global Philanthropic in 2002. I can't believe it's been that long now. He has supervised the establishment of the operations of the firm in the UK, Australia, Hong Kong, and Canada. And as group CEO, he's gained recognition as a leading thinker on philanthropy and giving, and a major gift strategist, an expert in structuring international campaigns and higher education fundraising. But his work also extends into advising private individuals, ultra high net worth individuals specifically, globally, to develop meaningful philanthropic giving strategies for some of those folks and their interactions with our charitable organizations, very key in this booming marketplace. Since founding Global Philanthropic in 2002, he has served as a senior strategy consultant to several thousand organizations across the world, including a number of Cambridge and Oxford University colleges, LSE, St. Andrews, Oberlin, the United Nations Foundation, a number of development charities, also including UNICEF, ActionAid, and schools such as St. Paul's and the International School of Beijing. So he really does know Asia in addition to every other part of the world. Ben has also co-authored Talking Philanthropy, Volume 1, a book which was published in 2017, and developed an international Talking Philanthropy Forum that's become an annual event for philanthropists and professionals in the field across the world. He speaks frequently on this topic, but not necessarily in this way. So we are really honored to have him here today. And with that, I'll pass the baton to Ben Morton Wright. Ben, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Jay and Hannah. I assume this is all working. As Jay said, it's technology is not my forte, so this is a relatively new medium, but I will try and keep to the script and try and keep to my time. And thank you all for dialing in to hear more about my favorite subject, which is around principles of fundraising in Asia. Why is it my favorite subject? Why is it something that I get super excited about? Well, for a number of reasons. It's the most exciting subject, I think, in philanthropy in the world at the moment. And it's also a massive subject with pretty profound implications in terms of what could happen over the next 10 to 20 years. And it's very important to stress that these are principles in a market that's rapidly changing and has changed. But there's issues that we should look at for the long term. It's not just the short term. And it's very much that long term. So we might be see day to day various press articles of trade wars or issues, but I'm interested in the long-term context of how philanthropy is going to develop over the next 20 years and how it's developed over the last 20 years. And as fundraisers in that context, how can we actually access this market and operate it in that market in the most professional way? And I come at this from a position where I can safely say I can put hand on my heart and say that I made all the mistakes for sure. I moved out to Hong Kong 16 years ago to set up the company and founded it, and if there was a mistake to be made in Asia, I sure enough did it. Lucky for the people we advise now, I can bring that to the table, but it really is so complex that and that's what's fun. It's quite hard if you're not approaching this from an informed perspective to do it in a way that is not going to upset donors and in a way that isn't going to cause you embarrassment as a professional. So from someone that's made all the mistakes possible, I'm going to share some of those the right ways of doing things in the next 45 minutes. I want to leave a fair amount of time for questions at the end, which I think Jay and Hans going to facilitate. I would like to repeat, if you'd like a copy of the slides or if you'd like any other further questions, if you put b.mw at the beginning of @globalphilanthropic, we'll make sure that you get a response and we'll make sure that you get a copy of the slide there. So the first issue I just wanted to mention was obviously the firm. The company I set up, as I've having been involved as a professional fundraiser for way over a decade working in the field, I set up Global Philanthropic actually in Hong Kong, and we have a fairly major operation in Asia out of Hong Kong, but we work across China, Southeast Asia, and also have worked in India. So Global Philanthropic is the company. We're set up to give strategic advice, but that's the commercial advert, so I'll stop there. Needless to say that if you do want professional help on this, please do come to us or a specialist in this area, because it's very important that you do actually engage with external specialist help. So today, what I want to do is I want to give an overview of Asian philanthropy. I want to talk about wealth transition and intergenerational giving. How Asia is actually different from the West. Some of the challenges and opportunities. And then we get into question and answers. So that's the context of today. It's what we've built, the various different segments of today. So let's get cracking. First thing I want to point out is there's actually very, very little data about philanthropy in Asia. And of course, Asia is a massive region of the world. But the reality is we've had very little research undertaken on philanthropy. It's not like many other parts in the world where you actually fill in your tax return. The tax return goes to a central government. They extrapolate what the tax return is. You then come up with the big numbers of what the GDP of the country is, how many people have given, what the average level of gift is, what kind of organizations are given to. In Asia, that just simply doesn't exist, mainly because you don't have tax advantages generally in Asia. And if you do, they're so small, normally people don't want to take advantage of them, or they want to keep an anonymity. So you don't have the gathering of the data at that level, and you don't have the research universities actually researching the subject. So 5 years ago, I would have been even more pressed to describe what was going on in terms of Asia, other than my experience on a day-to-day basis. Luckily, over the last 5 years, we've had some wonderful initiatives, and one of them is an organization called the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS, it's called if you Google it, and I think it's also down as our reference. You'll see their website. There's a few other links within that website that I'm going to point you to. But that is a wonderful organization that's been established by philanthropists looking at Asian philanthropy. And I do really urge you to actually go there first when you're actually approaching this issue of giving and how to access this incredible market. Because it tells you about the cultural nuances. It gives you a overview of the actual history of philanthropy, and it tells you all the drivers, the tax regime, and some of the summaries country by country, and it goes across Asia. Within that, there's a great book which has been recently published, which you can get on an e-version, and if you dive into the website, you'll find it's called Pragmatic Philanthropy. Again, in the beginning of each chapter on each country, you'll see the summary of the philanthropic history of Asia. And that's a very important thing to emphasize. You know, philanthropy is deep in Asia. It's been around for a long time. It's not something that's new. It's something that's been around for many centuries for a lot of these civilizations in Asia. So it's very important when we're approaching it as a professional, not to assume that it's just something that's popped up and it's something that's new. Actual fact, it's deep, and you need to understand the history. So pragmatic philanthropy is a great way of actually giving you a signpost on some of the issues country by country. Now, we all know that there's this massive wealth transfer that's going to happen. I call it the Carnegie moment. In the US, it's pretty well taken care of. So congratulations, because of the 460 families in the next 20 years, they're going to transfer, I think, something like 2 trillion. Those families in the US have pretty much, most of them have anyway, the enlightened ones have signed the giving pledge, have already started to create huge foundations to make sure that transition from their generation to the next generation comes through philanthropy. The great opportunity in Asia is that pretty much a third of those families live in Asia, and everything's to play for. You'll find both in Europe and Asia, very few people have signed the giving pledge. Those families are planning to give significant sums, but it's very early days. So, you know, be mindful, and this is something that has already been mentioned, that there's a huge amount of wealth outside the US that's got to go somewhere in the next 20 years. The stats also show us that Asia's home to a third of the wealthiest people. Now, you know, depends on which stat you want to look at. Ultra high net worth, middle class, rise of the middle class. Pretty much everywhere you look now, we're pretty well neck and neck. So the way I look at the world at the moment is a third of the wealthiest individuals live in the US and have done for significant time, and maybe it's slightly more than the third, but certainly the bulk of the wealthiest cluster of individuals is around the US, has been for some time, will continue for sure. But the reality is that Europe's caught up, and this is in the recent stats, and Asia's motored from a very weak position right up to being the third that we really want to look at today. So this wealth creation is something that's new. It's only happened, if you look at China, it's happened particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. But as a mass, I see the world as a world of a third of the wealthiest in Asia, a third in Europe, and a third in the US. So these are fairly equal measures. I mean, you can debate to the nth degree, but it's a pretty simple way of looking at this market, is that it's a third of the world. And yet, how many of these individuals have had that discussion around philanthropy? If you look at China, which is an area, I've been to China, I think 3 times the last 6 months, and Beijing, you find the last stats, again, these are referenced, 500 Chinese billionaires. That's gone up since this stat. This is every year it goes up. It's very significant. This is a few years old. if you actually extrapolated a 2% GDP, which is where we are in the US, which is the gold standard, it's the highest level of GDP given in the world, you're at 2%. If you extrapolated, and the Doing Good survey does this, it extrapolates that number, 2% of GDP in just China alone would give you 504 billion. That, I'm told, would pretty much sort out most of the sustainable goals, the UN sustainable goals. That's just from China alone. Now, of course, it's not 2% of GDP. It's remotely anything near that. But the economy, if it was reflective in the types of 1 to 2% of GDP, which is a mature philanthropic market, this is the kind of numbers you'll be talking about. So if you go down the line that eventually China could catch up with the gold standard of 2% of GDP, these are the kind of numbers that we're looking at. In terms of the private individuals, we're finding many now are creating own private foundations, particularly again in China, specifically around China. This stat is 2016, so it's a couple of years old. In the previous 4 years, to 4.6 billion amongst those top high net worth individuals, tripling in 4 years. This is incredible growth in the marketplace within China, and is reflected also across Southeast Asia and India. Now, the issue that you want to be considering in terms of accessing that money as well is that in Asia, that third of those ultra high net worth individuals are not in their 70s as they are in the US. They're not in their 70s as they are in Europe, but they're actually in their 50s. So the billionaires, the wealth is young, which means that they're going to be doing lifetime giving. It means that you've got a journey ahead of you of a long-term relationship in terms of your fundraising. So I know this is very much the macro. It's the big issues. It's the big context. But I think it's really important to understand that, because if you understand the context, you understand why I get excited about this. Because it is truly mind-blowing, the potential for philanthropy. Within this context, one of the first questions probably that's going to be asked, and is often asked to me, is to say, well, will it happen? Will individuals give? Is philanthropy part of the DNA of these societies, of these communities? Now, again, you can't generalize, because if you're going from India to China, they're very different communities. But what you do see is huge amounts of giving happening, particularly in the last 10 years, particularly in China, and particularly in the Chinese communities. $100 million gifts are not uncommon. They're increasing. The universities in those communities are getting significant support. So you're seeing incredible growth in the last decade, and the growth seems to extrapolate. So that would say to me that this is in the DNA, that as long as society encourages it and gives the context, and as we as professionals help unlock this market, there's no reason why it can't boom. The other wonderful thing about this market is that you're pretty much the first in the market. I was just with some billionaires in Asia the last few weeks, and when you have discussions, you're often the first person that's asked those individuals to consider making philanthropic gifts. Now, just think of that. Most billionaires, most ultra high net worth individuals have usually committed a substantial part of their resources in the West, and have probably been asked by several thousand fundraisers, let alone being the very first to ask for gifts. So it's that exciting, it's that young, it's that new, and it's incredible, the potential ahead. So as practitioners, where does this get us? How do we actually approach this whole market? What is it that we need to do that's different in terms of approaching this market? And I'm a great believer that there are, and based on all those mistakes I made all those years ago, there's actually a really profound issue that we need to reflect, and we need to think about very carefully before we go into Asian communities and start fundraising. And I've gone around this with many times with my colleagues, and thought long and hard about what it is, based on my own experience and how we advise our clients and what works. And I've come pretty much down to what I would call the 2-word presentation. And I think as professionals that are approaching this market, and even professionals in the market and people that are fundraising in the market, particularly at the high end, particularly at the major gift level. So I'm talking very much around the high end as well, but I think this is true across philanthropy. There's two words that you need to understand before you approach these markets, and that in my view, the two words drive philanthropy and fundraising and how you ask. And in many ways, what I'm going to ask you to do in many ways is to leave at the when you board the plane and you're flying to Asia, you kind of have to reprogram yourself. If you're a professional fundraiser, you kind of got to stop and reprogram yourself. And when you come off the plane on the other and step onto the earth of the country that you're in Asia, whatever country that is, because these two words are absolutely consistent across Asia, in my view, in more extreme than others. You have to think of these two guiding principles. So what are they? What's the secret sauce that we need to apply for successful fundraising? Well, the first issue is pretty obvious, actually. If you've been working in Asia, or if you're Asian, or if you worked in those communities, you'll be very aware that status is an issue that you need to be aware of, and it's particularly important when you're fundraising. Because if you're with a CEO or a senior trustee or someone that is seen as the head of the organization, that's a very, very important moment. And it's a very important issue for whoever you're talking to. Secondly, there is this status issues, and it depends, again, country by country, and it's a very complex subject, but there are status issues. And you'll find that for the big gifts and the really big gifts, that often the wealthiest individual gives the largest gift, because other people in that community won't want to look as if they're trying to outmaneuver that recognized position as the lead key individual in those communities. Now, again, this is a gross generalization, but it's very, very important. So when you're approaching fundraising, you need to use your assets and your key people and understand what status they may have in the communities and in those environments. And you need to also realize who you're approaching, particularly with high net worth individuals. It's often, and I've written about this, there's often what I call a domino effect, which you'll see, particularly in educational fundraising, where someone gives a very large gift first and everyone then follows behind, and will give always slightly smaller, and it will fall according to how people perceive each other's status and the community at large. And therefore, you have to play that game, and you have to play that out in terms of how you approach your communities and your fundraising. And you have to make sure that you do things in the right order and ask the right people in the right order. And that's quite different, and there's quite a different driver. The other issue, and so that, by the way, affects obviously how you approach those markets, but also how you ask. And the other issue is the whole issue of face. This is a real issue for fundraising. I mean, you're taught, and I was taught from day one, face-to-face, peer-to-peer, person-to-person. That is the mantra that we use. Now, the problem is that this conflicts. If you're in a high-status position and you have a certain amount of face, how do you ask for money if one of the answers could be no? How does someone tell you that they're not going to support you if they by doing that are going to lose face? So this becomes very problematic when you're asking and using the normal formula of peer-to-peer, face-to-face, and person-to-person. So what we advise very heavily is that you think about this issue and you actually try to avoid embarrassment, and you try to avoid the issue where someone may give you what they call a kiss-off gift or a smaller gift because they've been asked directly. And you also deploy intermediaries. Now in Asia, intermediaries are loved. They do all sorts of aspects of work in all sorts of sectors. They'll work with the family. And one of the reasons that intermediaries are so important is because they can be the go-to person, both sides of the equation in an ask, to make sure that face is preserved and that no one has loss of face. No one is asked for a gift that's too great that they wouldn't want to do it. Or if they are asked, then it's been agreed already through the use of intermediaries, or it could be the family members. It could be the second or third generation that acts as that intermediary. But it's been aware of the importance of that. It leads to what I call, the large game of chess that everyone has to play. And I'll elaborate this on the next slide, which goes into more detail. I'm not going to go into every single element of this, but what this slide, is to try and tease out the next slide I'm going to show you, a more in-depth version of this very simple status and face. My advice to you is maybe just think about these two elements. As I say, when you get into the idea of a Western versus Eastern and the giving implications, which I'll talk about in the middle, it gets slightly more technical, and it will also vary depending on which region of Asia you're in. So when we look at these, you can get into these different elements of these giving implications. Now, again, I would say these are big generalizations. They're not meant to be a definitive answer about where you have to go in terms of your giving and giving choices, and hierarchy and how our hierarchy is seen. These will vary depending on which country you're in, and some countries are much more hierarchy driven than others. This is changing as well. So some countries are slightly more progressive, where you don't have these tensions. But this diagram here is just a way of beginning to actually think about these two Western and Eastern approaches. Again, they're very, very general. You could take issue about the whole collectivism and Confucianism, and whether there is that, and whether Western individual tradition is what it is, as it is described in this. All these issues are things you can discuss, but what we're trying to do here is to think about what the individual might want in terms of their societal position and how their giving is seen. So certainly, I think one thing that is very, very true in my experience is about certainly honoring parents or honoring others, the desire to honor others. That's a huge issue in Asia. You'll find often that things are named in honor of others, and in the West it's more of an individual expression. And also the things that are popular to support are often around education, or slightly more what I could say slightly more low risk options for philanthropy. And I think so these are all different drivers and dynamics, and as fundraisers we should just at least give some thought to how this, whether there's an implication on who we're asking and in which country we're asking. Now, great bit of research now. This is Harvard Ash, back into the stats, into the hardcore stats of the kind of things that people are looking to support in Asia. Now, this obviously is China, but in my experience is pretty consistent across Asia. Education is a massive driver in Asian philanthropy at the moment. Most universities in China and in Hong Kong and in East Asia have enormous support already through major philanthropic programs. And the reason is because people like to support education. Arts and culture, you see down there at 13%, is a lower figure. I would bet that that's going to grow and it will develop. We've done a lot of work around arts and culture. It's a very new area, and it's an area that's pretty much in an early stage, but it's going to mature and develop. And I think you'll see that chunk grow. But these are the priorities for Chinese philanthropists, but I think it's applicable across Asia. Again, if you look at the Doing Good Index, you'll see this is reflected across Europe, across Asia. You'll find that different countries have different emphasis. There's also a philanthropic index that's been produced, which is also worth looking at, the BNP Paribas Wealth Index, which also shows the drivers. And again, if you Google that, shows the drivers of what people actually want to support in Asia. So the good news, if you're in education, that's a great spot to be just at the moment. But I think these things will develop and progress as the market becomes more mature, and as also people become less risk averse, because education is a low risk philanthropic opportunity. Conversely, being a high brand in education, whether it's school or university, is also, or a big brand in that field, is also a great opportunity globally, because people will want to support that. So in terms of the next issue, which is the complexities, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the complexities. There's complexities around making the ask, which I've touched on, and some guiding principles that you can try and deploy when you're getting off that plane. But there's also complexities around so many other issues. One of the big issues that the Doing Good survey highlights is what they describe, they describe it around the trust issue, right? And I would describe as the lack of trust. And that's the lack of trust around organizations within Asian communities. And the research has shown that that's a big constraint for why people pull back from giving to organizations within their communities in Asia. And it could be the driver why there has been such support out with the communities for big brands, big names. That is one of the issues. And one of the concerns around this is, how do you actually instill trust? How do you convince people that these NGOs are well managed, which many are, and you can trust these organizations to deploy your philanthropic resources effectively? So it's a big issue, and it's something that we need to address within the marketplace to encourage philanthropy. The next piece, which is a seminar in itself, is the whole issue of legal constraints. It's a fast-moving subject. I do suggest you employ a good legal counsel around what you can do in different contexts, different countries, and what kind of organizations legally you can fundraise for and from, and how you can construct gifts. There are a number of legal constraints, not always straightforward, not always clear. You may get many different levels of advice. So it's not always straightforward, but it's something that you should be thinking about as you move forward, making sure that your entities and your conduct is obviously within the appropriate legal constraints. There's also an issue which is quite fundamental, which is around movement of money. And obviously India and China both have this issue about actual currency movement, and that can become a major issue for big gifts that may be transnational. The other point here is just Asia is so diverse. And again, this research, the Doing Good research, the Philanthropy Index, all reflect just that diversity. It's a massive part of the world. You can't just talk about it as one word, Asia. It represents such incredible diversity, such immense richness and cultural richness, that it would be foolhardy just to see it as one market. So it really is about doing your homework on those countries that you're approaching, and also just reading literature on what is culturally appropriate, how to conduct yourself and not embarrass yourself as a very basic level before you then get into actually how you ask for money. I talked a bit about opportunities, and I think this is where I get super excited again, because this is, I hope I've demonstrated to everyone, this is a massive market long term. It's phenomenal what could happen in philanthropy if we went anywhere near that 2% just in one country, let alone the whole of Asia. Will it happen? I'm a great believer it will. I'm a great believer in the long term. You've got huge creation of wealth. You have to redistribute that back through philanthropy. We've got a situation where many of these countries have moved from, in the last 40 years, from very strict communist, very rigid rules, which don't even allow wealth creation, to a situation where you have individuals that are almost so wealthy they're called the sovereign individuals now. They're as large as small countries. So you've got a very different landscape, and the reality is, with so much need within Asia, there's so many things that need to be done that philanthropy, in my view, will just grow and develop like we've not seen before, and it could be absolutely phenomenal what philanthropy can do for the people of these countries, and how it can be developed across Asia. So as you're approaching that, particularly if you're approaching from the US or Europe, there is what I would call the first mover advantage, which is I always envisage this as a queue. And if you have, when I are in the US, which I have been particularly recently quite a lot, when you talk to donors, they generally have been asked by several people that week. They're already giving to their church, their school, their children's school, their university, their chosen charity, etc., and have been doing for a long time. You go to Asia, you'll find that you're the first person to have a discussion often about gifts. So there's a first mover advantage. We know that our existing donors are our future donors. We know that acquisition for donors is the most expensive thing to do. So by getting into these markets, although they're complex and they're difficult and they're challenging, actually you can get first movers advantage. The next piece, I think, is about employment opportunities. And I think as a profession, the need for professionals in Asia and across Asia that have high good moral codes and high ethics and can conduct themselves in a way that will build that trust is critical. And the challenge for organizations to actually deploy and employ and train is just mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. There's so few people in these countries that we've talked about that actually know how to fundraise properly. So there's a huge opportunity there to actually develop and help develop a really professional capacity in each of these countries around fundraising. But it's going to require training and developing literally thousands of fundraisers, which at the moment are not there. Which comes on to this final point here in terms of the opportunities, which is really this is yet to be shaped. I think the most exciting thing about this whole area is that what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is just the beginning, in my view. And if it does take off, as I predict it will do, continues to grow, particularly amongst the top end and the high net worths, and they continue to do more and more in this space, then the whole environment needs to be shaped. So we need to help shape this in terms of code of ethics, in terms of the trust issue, in terms of professionals working within the space, in terms of governments understanding what philanthropy can do and how it can help, in terms of the appropriate regulatory framework being developed that isn't actually so onerous that it snuffs out philanthropy, but actually encourages and fosters it. And then you have the whole piece around actually encouraging ultra high net worth or high net worth individuals or wealthy individuals within the communities to actually see philanthropy as something that should be done as part, something that should be celebrated, should be applauded, and the government should support that, civil society should support that. So there's a whole series of dynamics that we need to consider in terms of shaping that philanthropic environment. And it can easily go wrong, as we've seen, scandals in Asia can cause real problems for the whole marketplace. So helping shape that and acknowledging that it's there to be shaped and trying to make sure that that's done in a positive way actually comes back to the first point, which is if we as professionals are either working in Asia as fundraisers or approaching that market as fundraisers and trying to unlock this new wealth that's there, we have actually a humble responsibility and a moral responsibility to do that in a way that is ethical and is going to help set the pace for everyone to really shape that in the right way. So that kind of concludes my presentation. So I would maybe open it up, Jay, for questions. I think I've got 15, 20 minutes left. And I think, Jay, if you could facilitate that, that would be great. I will give my email address. Just again, please do email me if you've got specific questions or you'd like the slide deck. So it's b.mw@globalphilanthropic.com. Obviously, we as a firm are all over the world, so we're always happy to talk. That's my commercial break over and done with. But I think you'll hopefully see that this is a super exciting marketplace, but it's super complex. But it really is so exciting as fundraisers going into this that it's worthy of giving some thought about how we shape that marketplace and how we approach it as fundraisers.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really, really do appreciate it. Great content. And for everyone, I'm going ahead and putting Ben's email address into the chat section, so you can look for that later if you did not hear that. Ben, I'm just going to repeat it to make sure I have it correctly. Is that B as in Ben, .mw as in Morton Wright at globalphilanthropic.com?
That's it.
Okay, so everybody, you can look for it right there and click on that to send him a note. And as I mentioned, if you would like a copy of the slide deck, as he just said, just make sure you post that right now in the questions tab, along with any other question or comment you might have. And we're going to go ahead and give you a minute to write those in. And I have a few questions of my own as well that I might interject. But first, I'm going to go ahead and take a look and see what we have coming in. And we do have a number of people requesting a copy of the slide deck. One of the first comments here was about asking, this is from Carl, who says, can you please share more about moving money transnationally?
Yeah, well, that's a great subject. The reality is it can be problematic. And as I said, China and India, it's always been an issue. You've got to bear in mind that if the context of even currency exchange for the RMB, for example, in China, this has only been something that's actually, it's only been allowed to be exchanged in the relative recent history, let alone the idea of using it as a currency that you can transfer between countries. So when it comes to actually, so it's moved a lot, and I think it will inevitably move. It could go one of two ways. It could retrench and there could be more currency exchange regulations, or it could open up even more. I suspect it will open up even more. And the reality is where that affects your giving is that if you want to have a major gift and you negotiate and someone wants to give you a very large sum of money, just the actual physical moving the money from one country and out of the country can be a legal challenge. So it's just to be aware of that. Now, most ultra high net worths or philanthropists that are in the sort of 1 to 10 billion range, let's say at the top end, normally have funds all over the world. They have property, they have investment, they have businesses. And normally their accountants and their advisors can work out how to do it. But it's just a case of being aware of that. So it's about currency, it's about restrictions on currency movements in and out of the country. So, in actual fact, a lot of Western countries also have this as well, but and the amounts that are moved. The other issue you should be aware of is that the banking sector, the whole sector is more licensed, as we all know. The banking sector is even more sensitive around, quite rightly, in many ways, because they're personally liable in many countries. So there's also sensitivities around large sums of money moving around within banks, and you often have to make sure that they're aware that of the gift agreements and make sure that you've got your bases covered, so there's no concerns around that as well, because large movements of money into country can actually alert all sorts of things now that in the past maybe people weren't so aware of.
Ben, that brings me to one of my questions, which is what do you recommend people turn to for advice on the legal constraints, such as the movement of money, or is there a tax implication for giving a gift? Sometimes that happens in other countries. Where is there a place that you turn to, either as a print resource or
So the best resource for just the basic tax question, which is a really good question, is actually the Doing Good survey. There's a percentage graph on each country that goes through that you'll see, shows what tax relief you can get in each country, including China. And there is tax relief. Of course, it's very difficult to get it. It's not straightforward, because even giving to a non-profit in China doesn't get you your tax relief. You often have to do it through an agency. So it's not as straightforward as it looks. But the point is, it at least gives you a guide on whether there is a tax incentive, and you should be looking at that. The reality is that, another thing I didn't really mention for a lot of Asia is that, and it's maybe stating the obvious, but it isn't so obvious, is that when you're talking with individuals, you're also talking to their private family, you're also talking to their trust, and you're also talking to their company. They are as one. So there isn't often, the issue of tax really isn't in there often. It's very different than the end of year tax deadline when we're all furiously filling in our forms to make sure that we maximize our tax benefit. The level of taxation is not the same. The need for reporting it isn't the same, and the governments aren't giving the relief as well, which isn't the same. So it's much more complicated than just the issue of whether there's a tax relief. It's also how can you engineer it to get it. So I think that's a good starting point. We're not lawyers or tax advisors, goodness me, and it's very important that we state that. So we really can't give advice on these issues, but I'm afraid we can point you to lawyers and tax advisors, so at least you have your bases covered. And you certainly should have that. You should have that on your speed dial to make sure that you do have a chosen advisor in each of those. It's actually very important from the donor's point of view, not just from the recipients, and that's often our advice. It's as much a concern for the donors in those countries to make sure that they're right as it is the recipients. So it's a vested interest for your donors to understand what they're doing and to make sure that it's legal and compliant.
Right. Well, and it's probably important to note that as you said, there's a big opportunity out here. You've been talking about that throughout the presentation, but that also means there are a lot of big opportunities among individual donors. So if you're at an institution where you don't have this legal advice yet and you think it might cost you some time and some money to get it, it's good to put it in perspective. These are people who are, as the people Ben advises, often ultra high net worth individuals. We're talking about people with $50 million or above US. These are very significant opportunities for people who are not overly saturated necessarily by appeals to the things that matter to them. So this is well worth the investment. We have a question from Pam saying, what is the classic mistake that you see companies, perhaps she also means organizations, making? What's one of those classic mistakes?
Classic mistake is to not understand those fundamental two words, which is status and face. And when I first turned up in Hong Kong, for example, which, by the way, I think the current estimates are that Hong Kong gives, well, it depends how you look at it, but I would argue that it gives more $1 million plus gifts than the whole of the United Kingdom, because the ones that we know about, if you compare it, they're the ones that are, as opposed to the ones that are reported, they're the ones we found out about. So if you add in the ones that probably aren't actually reported, because you don't have to report them, you're way over a billion, whatever, 800 million to a billion, which is larger than the whole of the United Kingdom. So, this is a huge, it's a huge amount of giving that's happening. So I think those two issues of status and face, and we go back to Hong Kong, when I first got there, the amount of times I had people say to me, well, my university or college, very good brands, very good organizations, have just been through, and the head of it stood up waving a checkbook saying, you've got to put in your money, we need your money, help us now. It's just so wrong. It's just so wrong culturally to do that. Or to have asked for a very large sum of money in the middle of the first dinner that someone's had with no relationship. Would be, by the way, the third word I would add is relationship. It's very important you have a relationship, whatever the approach. You need to have known the person and actually and trust, and they need to trust you, and that's how Asia works in many ways. So status and face are the two issues, and so many people just don't get that, and they rush in and they really embarrass themselves and they upset everyone. So I think it's just reflecting. You can't rush it. Everything in Asia, which is the beauty of it, it's all about a long game. That the investors all take a long view, families take a long view, governments take a long view. Everything's on a long view, and philanthropy needs to be the same. You need to build relationships before you make asks. You need to use intermediaries so the asks aren't embarrassing anyone. This is all long-term play. I always say, if you want to be in Asia, don't just turn up and go once. That's more insulting than than not going at all. So you've got to commit to it, and it's got to be a long-term piece.
Yeah. We have a question from Susan who asks something I wanted to ask. How can we engage an intermediary for fundraising?
Well, I'm afraid the simple answer is you can look at Global Philanthropic, but I would say that. No, actually, isn't joking aside, we do a lot of intermediary, but it doesn't actually have to be a professional advisor. It could often be, I always say, when you meet with a high net worth family, find out who's in the room. And often you'll have people that come along to the meeting and you wonder why they're there. They could be a friend, or they could be a lawyer, or they could be a friend of a friend. But quite often they're the intermediary. They're the chosen one to do the deal with. So it doesn't have to be a paid for intermediary. It can be actually an intermediary that's actually brought to the party by the other donor. But you need to be aware to spot that and to try it out. I think second generation and third generation are really critical players. I've done many deals with children of billionaires, because that's how it's done, and it's put back up to the head of the family. And when the deal's done, you go and thank them. The ask is actually not actually made. It's a negotiation between the children.
It is really the family, like you said, and sometimes the family and the company, they're all tied together.
All tied. Foundation, family, company, all of it's interwoven.
Absolutely. And someone asked, well, in fact, I wanted just to add one question to that, which is, if you don't have the good fortune of working with Global Philanthropic, or let's say you're trying to set up a relationship with an intermediary, perhaps it's close to your network. I've heard universities do this in the past. You have alumni there in the country for many years, et cetera. How do you vet your intermediary?
Another tricky question. I think the best way of doing good fundraising in Asia is to build relationships, is to get out there and is to get trusted relationships, and then you can ask around, frankly, in a very discreet way, and it becomes pretty obvious who's seen in a good way and who isn't, who's safe and who isn't, and you can do all the research in the world, and that helps. Obviously, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. But unfortunately, it's back to the old shoe leather. There's no other way around it. You got to get out there, and you've got to talk to people and build relationships and have lots of dinners and lots of meetings, and you've got to get to a point where everyone trusts you, and then you will be able to ask those kind of questions. And I think really it's very hard to do it any other way. You can't rush this stuff.
Yeah. Ben, on the same token, you mentioned the importance of getting to know the marketplace. And oftentimes in the past, it's been an issue with vetting the donor. And as you pointed out in the beginning, getting that kind of research done is not an easy task. But if sometimes it's not easy to know on the face of things that a donor might be radioactive locally. I think of the old Sasakawa issues when he was alive, the father was alive, and it was problematic for other Japanese donors, but they wouldn't say that publicly. But you knew if you went and you got that money from them at that time, this was decades ago, that you might not be receiving money from other Japanese donors. How does one go about the process of properly assessing whether or not the donor is an appropriate relationship for you?
You just touched on something that demonstrates my point. It's all about face. People wouldn't tell you that that's a problem, right? And the issue of association becoming an issue of face. So you just absolutely beautifully demonstrated why understanding face is so important. Now, how do you find out? Now, this isn't just an Eastern problem. We all know this. This is a Western problem. This is a problem in philanthropy, which is about how can you make sure that your donors are going to enhance your brand. And it's not just an Eastern issue. We have it across the world. There's two sides of the coin. One side is you can't control what your donor does for the rest of their lives, right? So as soon as you take money from anyone, you are also vulnerable. So obviously you want to make sure in your gift agreements that you can remove names. You can do that in a way that isn't going to end up in a court case. Thought that through, and the donor's very clear about that. I think the advantage of my experiences of fundraising in the East is that often people will want to honor their father or their mother, or academics if it's universities, or great people, or whatever it may be, or prime ministers, or whatever it may be. And you're on safer territory there, obviously, because what's going to happen has happened already. So you can take a view on whether you want to be associated with that individual as well. But the reality is you can ask about, I think, if you get good trust that people will, in a roundabout way, indicate what is a good idea and what isn't. But it's all in code often because of the face issue, and it's understandable. You know, people won't. It's you know, it's not often. It's not about bad mouthing people, or it's just not right to be talking about people in that way. So you do have to read the code. You have to. Goes back to my point of this being a huge game of chess, right? It is risky, but then again, it's risky to take money also with many, as we found, you know, and there's been many examples of names have had to come off the buildings because of people involved in all sorts of scandals. So it's not just an Eastern issue, but it's harder. You're right. You know, it's harder to take a view on it because research is harder. But I would also trust gut instinct. I mean, I'm a great believer in walking around the block. You know, if things don't feel right, then they're probably not right. And I know that's totally unscientific, but that's my best rule of thumb.
Well, and that may be a perfect place to end, and also to make the point that we never do these sessions saying you should turn to these people because they'll tell you what to do. But in this case, we have to say you should turn to these people because they know what to do. Building the gut for doing something right in a market also means that you've been eating the food and you know that it sits well with your stomach. So if you're going to trust your gut, you better know somebody who can tell you what to eat as well as everything else. And that's certainly Ben and his team at Global Philanthropic. So thank you very much, Ben, for being willing to share some of this. And hopefully we can have you back to talk maybe even about another region of the world in the not too distant future.
Sure, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for asking me. And I hope that's given some insight. You know, it's a massive subject. And doing it justice in an hour is probably a bit of a stretch. But I've got some references I've left you at the end here. There's some really good work out there that you can Google and search, and it's a good starting point. But thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us, and hopefully you found that, and the people who have dialed in have found that of help.
And I want to encourage everybody again, if you have not said you want these slides, you won't be able to click these hyperlinks unless you get the slides. And the only way in this case that he can send them to you is if you request it. So it's just making sure we're honoring both the principle and the facts of data protection. So in this case, we are encouraging you to go ahead and post a note in the questions tab with your email address, and then he will be able to see it and send this slide deck to you. And if, of course, you'd like to share the recording, you'll find it, as always, in the Flash Class library at donorsearch.net. Again, that's donorsearch.net. Under the resources tab, Flash Class Library. This will be there in just the next couple of days, so be on the lookout. Also, I want to encourage you all to come back again tomorrow when we have Kathleen Lohr, the author of really important work in just the recent months on women in philanthropy. She will be doing a session tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on gender matters, a practical approach to grow women's philanthropy. And just as we're talking about Asia, half the population of the world, it's an important marketplace. It's also just an important place to be aware of in the world of philanthropy. We had better be aware of women in philanthropy. It's 51% of the U.S. market. And understanding and being sensitive to the differences within that marketplace are extremely important. And we've got a person who can address them in a very, very in-depth manner tomorrow. So please do join us at 3 p.m. Eastern for that. We want to thank, as always, our friends at DonorSearch for providing this platform so we can have sessions like these with you. And, of course, there in the background, of course, our stalwart producer who's making sure that we're on time, and since it's 2, we are on time to close. Thank you all very much. This has been Jay Frost speaking. It's been a pleasure having you. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.